All right, so today on this podcast, I wanted to give some insight on how you guys can use RPE better in your training, since this is something that I think is a really key skill for lifters to learn if they're really serious about getting the best results out of their training. Um, for strength sports mostly, but it also does have a pretty big role in physique sport. So first off, just to preface, what is RPE for those of you who may not be familiar with what it actually is. So RPE is basically a system that defines how hard a set was on a scale of 1 to 10. Usually we use RPEs of 5 to 10, since that correlates to 5 or less repetitions in reserve. So for example, if you were to get an RPE 7 set, that says that you could do 3 more reps. If you get an RP 7.5 set, it means you could have done 2 more reps with maybe a little bit more weight. That's sort of what it means. Now, this was adapted from the Borg RPE scale, which is measured on a scale of 6 to 20, which was basically for endurance athletes. And it actually correlated with the heart rate that the athlete was experiencing. And Mike Teixeira, who is the owner and founder of Reactive Training Systems, basically took that Borg RPE scale and adapted it to lifters. So that's essentially what the RPE is basically aiming to do. So what are some pros of using RPE in training, and why do I personally recommend it? So I think number one is that it's a skill that builds athlete objectivity, and essentially you're going to be able to better understand how hard that you are pushing in training, and will become better at putting the right weight on the bar more times. It also allows you to auto-regulate your training based off of fluctuations in performance for that session. And basically, you have 2 components of fitness and fatigue that are going to impact the overall weight that you can lift on the barbell on any given day. And this is basically to say, fitness is the positive adaptations that we get from training, like increased muscle mass, increased strength, stuff like that. And then you're going to also have fatigue that is a consequence of that. So something like soreness or some neurological fatigue, stuff like that is what you get from it. And essentially, the sum of fitness and fatigue on any given day dictates how much you're going to be able to lift on one day. And I'm sure that any of you guys who have done lifting weights, you know that your performance is not the same on one day. So for example, if you were to go into the gym and you were to hit a RPE 8 single, so again, you could have done 2 more reps on edit, and then try to go into the gym the day after that, try to lift the same weight, you would realize pretty fast that, well, what I hit at an RPE 8 on that day is actually not my RPE 8 on this day. And that's basically due to fatigue. And so because we understand that performance fluctuates on any given day, we are going to need to auto-regulate our load selection for the session based off of where we are at. And so that basically has a big pro versus using like a training max, because it really allows you to truly match your abilities on any given day. Now, you can use sort of this Rpe percentage chart. And this is something I actually do give my athletes. And it's, if you just look up on Google or whatever, Rpe percentage based chart, you'll actually find this. And I think that you can use that as a good starting point. But you should be very, very open and understanding that this can fluctuate up or down up to 3 to 5%, depending upon the current day and what you're currently dealing with. So this is basically going to allow you to better make the proper load selection, which is really everything with long-term strength adaptations, because what we care about is we're going to put the right weight on the bar that will allow us to get stronger over and over and over again without getting excessively fatigued. So that's one of the reasons why I do use RPE in training. The second main reason is going to be RPE basically allows for me to communicate to my athletes about how hard I want their training session to be, and sort of what I want them to get from a certain session. Because like I said, if we were to only have one training session, I was like, okay, like if you want to get as strong as you possibly can, you only can train once. Well, we would go all out. Now, the problem with going all out and maxing out every single day or something like that is that performance becomes pretty unpredictable on one point. Two, you're not really able to create any sort of training momentum in the long run. And that's really, I think, like the main reason, because we want to get stronger over time, not just in one session. And if we train with too high of a fatigue stimulus relative to the training stimulus, we're going to actually find that we have less productive training sessions. We're not able to get as strong. This is also one of the reasons why usually in my programming systems, I do tend to not keep a static, RPE 7 to 8, throughout the entire training block. I do tend to start from like a lower RPE, say around RPE 5 to 6, then end off that block with an 8 to 9, for a couple of reasons. I think number one, it allows for a little bit better progress to be realized over the long run, to basically have a higher weight that you can use at the end, because you're going to be getting a little bit of better fitness stimulus relative to the fatigue. So that's one big thing. The second thing is going to be so going back to that. Sorry. Say you could start off. You had like you see if you're going in like week one, and you're asking one rep max from like a single at 8 with like 450 was like 500 pounds, and you try to just do that like all week, all the entire time, and then you maybe go to like 455 or like 460. That can happen, but sometimes I do find it then generally tends to have a little bit better results, or maybe the athlete could do a little bit more weight, like let's say a 465 at 8, because they are not getting the same level of fatigue during the training block, and so they're able to get a little bit of a better stimulus to fatigue rate ratio on the net balance throughout the entire training block. Now, there's not to say that I don't give some of my athletes a static RPE, but I do like ascending RPE. I do think that you should find that most of the time in most RPE-based training protocols, because it tends to manage long-term fatigue a lot better. So that's one thing. And then I think that the second thing is that it basically allows you to make sure that you are going to be getting the most out of long-term training and having all this momentum going. And I'm going to actually be able to have my athletes understand a little bit more about how they adapt over time, to where they're going to be able to actually understand how they need to like pace their progression and whatnot. And when I'm coaching an athlete, I want them to make sure that they understand, what the purpose of the session is and how hard I want everything to be. So that's one other thing. I can kind of also look at what's like how accurate the athlete's RPE actually is. So essentially, something that I do like to use when I am teaching my athletes about sort of gauging RPE is I like to use both a bar speed sort of meter and also a how heavy did that feel. So say in RPE 7, so RPE 6 is going to basically be really 5 to 6. It's going to basically be it felt relatively light on the last set, on the last rep of that last set, because again, you're only measuring the last rep of the set. Like none of the other ones before matter. It's only you're just judging the RPE on the last rep of the last set. I will basically say the RPE 5 to 6 is going to be pretty light. There's no bar speed. Slow down. RPE 7 generally tends to feel slightly heavier than those weights, and there might be a little bit more bar speed slow down, but it's slight. In RPE 8, it's going to feel moderately heavier, and it's going to have a very moderate bar speed slow down, but there shouldn't be any sort of grindiness to the rep. Then RPE 9 is going to be, it feels really heavy, and there was some sort of grind during that set. Then RPE 10 as well felt really, really heavy, and you basically almost died on the set. So that's one way that you can sort of you get a little bit better at judging your RPE. Now, some people will have different RPEs based on different muscle groups, like what the muscle fiber composition is. So, for example, if you're really slow twitch, you can probably grind out rep after rep after rep after rep, and you're going to have a relatively linear bar speed velocity decay. Whereas if you have So if you're very fast with muscle fibers, you're probably going to, it's going to look kind of fast until it's not. And so using me as an example, I have really long arms on bench press. And so for me, I know if I had any sort of sticking point on my bench press, it's actually an RPE 9. RPE 7 and 8 actually have very little bar speed slow down. Whereas on squats, for example, I am very much a grinder. I can grind through reps, it will actually look kind of grindy, even at like RPE 7. So again, this is another reason why when you are using RPE, understand that you don't need to be perfect. It's just a skill that you build up over time. It's something that will help you make better progress in the long run. So be patient with it. It doesn't really matter that you're perfect from the get-go. What matters is that you're thinking about how hard your training is. And over time too, especially with this sort of ascending RPE approach, you can basically, maybe you're going from RPE 6, 7, 8, 9, in a 4-week block, for example. You can kind of understand, okay, how hard am I actually pushing? So now another reason why I think RPE training is really good is that it's not practical to program in percentages on like an accessory movement. So like double lateral raises. You don't need to know what your max weight is, to get a good stimulus on a pull down or lateral raise or whatever. So essentially using RPE of like an 8 to 9, for example, which is what I would usually give my athletes, basically means, hey, I want you to push yourself hard on these, but probably leave at least like 1 rep in the tank. That's about what I would say with that. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. And it also just allows you to take more control over your training progression, because like I said earlier, circling back, is you can generally pace your rate of progression a lot better and probably end up at a higher ending point with your overall strength, because you're going to be able to truly match your abilities on that given day to the training block. And for example, what I've noticed is that some blocks you're able to adapt pretty linearly, and whatever, or some blocks you have a really big like spike out of nowhere. Just as an example, on this recent training cycle I had, I was using 10s on squat and 5s. My first week, 342 for a 3x10 was pretty dang hard. About RP like 5, 6-ish. 10s are always hard for me, like no matter what. Like if just all the cardio metabolic fatigue, it's pretty gnarly. But I also, I made a very small jump up to 353 for that second week. Still felt about the same difficulty, but then because I was patient, didn't try to like force my progression or anything, I actually had a really big performance increase on that third week, where it's basically going to be, I was able to add essentially 22 pounds from 353 to 375. And the reason why I was able to do that was because I was patient enough with my load progression, and I matched it to really how fast I was adapting. Whereas if you say I was doing like a percentage based increase, I might have to start out a little bit too fast for that block. And, maybe I needed to start off a little bit slower to really let those adaptations start to take place, especially in a new rep range. You're going to find that probably like it's going to take about 1 or 2 weeks for you to get the repeated battle effect going, where you're going to be able to recognize it as a stimulus and make positive adaptations from it, and then be able to get stronger from that point. So that's one thing. As well, looking at my 5 start with 407 for my top set of 5 RP 5. Then I did 430, about an RP like 6-ish to 7-ish. And the next week I did 446 to the same thing. So that's sort of one of the main things that you will realize. And the reason why, I made those little sorts of jumps too, is to have a little bit more experience with it. But usually what happens if you have a bad day, where you're a little bit more fatigued, if you actually auto-regulate and you don't try to force the weight, and again, remind yourself in that moment, my max is just down this day. I can't force the weight if it's not there. You have to be pretty mature with it. Be like, okay, the smart move here is for me to actually reduce the weight on the bar and just take what the session is giving me. And usually what happens after those sessions is you're going to have a pretty large increase in performance in the next one. So that's one thing that I think is really, really important for you to just remember. It is actually a part of the system to take advantage of good days, and also to regulate down when, for whatever reason, you're not as strong as you want it to be on a particular day. And understand, importantly, that is not a loss. That's just a part of the training process. That's just how things go sometimes. So be mature, and you can also usually generate a more positive association with like how training goes, just because you're going to understand like there's a lot, like as much as we like to think for progress to be linear, it's just not. And having these, you're going to have fluctuations, and the trend over time matters. So the only way that you're going to actually know if your training stimulus is correct with your training program is if you're actually following your training program and you're not forcing weights on the bar that just aren't there. Again, that's not how this works. You need to pay attention to long-term trends. So be smart and do your job with that stuff. So going back to, I'm sure a lot of you guys are thinking, okay, those are some really good reasons for me to start using RPE in my training, but like, how do I even start using it? And like I said, this is a skill. It takes practice. You're not going to be good at it from the get-go. But remember that every single lifter that you see who uses RPE rather proficiently nowadays started in your shoes. And over time, is going to learn how to do it better and understand how what are your RPE is on the different lifts, different exercises, how to gauge things, how hard you can actually push. And I actually call this skill training instinct with the more advanced that you do get. You will understand what weight you will put on the bar, what's a smart training choice, etc. But when you are starting it, I would really recommend that you think of RPE as a range instead of a fixed value. So if I program an RPE for one of my lifters, I like to think of that prescribed RPE as more of a guiding range about how hard I want that set to feel. So, for example, if I program an RPE 7, anything within a 6.5 to 7.5 RPE is totally fine because the response to that stimulus is actually going to be rather similar. So that's one of the things that I think people stress out on. I have to be exactly RPE 7. We want you to be within that range. There's some bandwidth here with the certain RPE. So just again, try to be as accurate as you possibly can. But as you gain more experience with the system, you're going to be able to be more and more accurate. The goal is not to be perfect. It's just to be able to. It's important that you're just able to somewhat objectively measure, how you're actually, how many reps you actually have in the tank. I would also say, do not make the mistake of thinking about your RPE during the set. When you are in the set, your job is to execute that lift, focus on it, move with maximal intent, maximal speed on all reps, and focus on having a great set. I would really recommend, as soon as you rack the barbell, think about only how hard was that last rep, because that's all that matters. That's what we are gauging our RPE off of. And then just move on from there. And as you gather more information about yourself, like I said earlier, you're also going to understand how everything feels on each lift. So when you are starting out, just start thinking about it a little bit. Be like, okay, how hard was that? How many more reps could I have done? And try to be as honest with yourself as possible. And that's where you start. So now, like I said earlier, how will you know what sort of RPEs feel like? I made a video on this on my YouTube channel. I already went over this, but essentially RPE 5 and 6, really anything below 7 is going to feel pretty light. There shouldn't really be much of any bar speeds to slow down. 7s are going to feel somewhat, you might have a little bit of bar speeds slow down, but it should still feel, relatively light. I actually think it's also, I do notice on the RPE 7, you tend to have to focus a little bit more on that last rep. RPE 8 is going to feel a little bit heavier. You might have some more bar speed slow down than an RPE 8. It's going to feel a little bit heavier on your back. Like it's not going to feel as light as a 7. RPE 9 is going to feel pretty heavy. You're going to have a sticking point. You're going to have to grind through it. RPE 10 is very much a grind. I also would say when you are gauging RPE, it's important to really look at the sticking point of the lift only, because that's where you're going to miss. So for example, on bench press, it's how sticky am I just off my chest around mid-range, how sticky was things around the hole of my squat when I'm coming up about a parallel. And then on deadlift, it's about how hard was it around my knees when I'm trying to extend my hips and lean back. So that's what I would also recommend, is only think about how hard was that sticking point, not any other part of it, because again, that's where you're going to miss. So how do you know what weight to use when using RPE? So I do recommend that when you are starting out lifting, that you use an RPE chart for goal weights. Understand that can be 3 to 5% fluctuations upwards or downwards depending upon your fitness levels on that given day. But I do recommend that as you do get to be more advanced, that you rely a little bit less on that past week one, and just think about adding about 3 to 5% of load to basically week to week if you have an RPE increase of 1, or adding 2 to 3% week to week if you have an RPE increase of about half. So for example, if you had, and the reason why there's the range is going to be basically depend upon how fast are you personally adapting. So 2% probably on the low end, but if you're adapting a little bit faster with your RPE, you can probably add 3% if you are, if that's what the day is giving you. If you are going up 1 full RPE, maybe you only plan on 3%, but you're like, okay, if things feel pretty good, I can probably add upwards of 5%. And that's what I would recommend as a general guideline. Some people, can add a little bit more than that, but most people probably not. This is really what I would recommend. Like the only way that you could probably add more than that is you really, really sandbagged week one, or or whatever, and you just had to make more progress. And that's sometimes how some lifters do things. I know that Stephen Novi from PRS Performance has one athlete where they add 40 pounds week to week, which is a 10% jump basically for most people. But I would really recommend keep within those constraints for most people. But don't get married to the RPE chart. Just have a goal weight and understand that you're going to ultimately auto-regulate your training to match your performance on any given day. So that's the podcast. I wanted to just go over this because I get a lot of questions about this. I get a lot of my athletes who are newer to RPE who are a little bit confused about how to use the system properly. And this is a really good way for you to be able to learn a little bit more about yourself, think a little bit better, make smart training decisions, be able to make more progress in the long run, and really be able to, sort of, I guess, become the best version of yourself. I guess one last point I wanted to say is that I think that percentage-based programs are completely fine. I think that there's other, you can obviously have both of those in place. And like I said, there's a connection between them, but there's a lot of differences between lifters that can impact how hard, a certain weight feels or whatever, depending upon range of motion. Like if you have a really short range of motion, you're not going to exactly have the same RPE chart as something that has a very long range of motion. Stephen Novi made a video on this about how distance traveled affects programming and how it affects sort of your own individual RPE chart based off of range of motion. But in general, I would say that doesn't matter as much. You don't really necessarily need to worry about that. Worry about hitting the right RPEs, because what matters most is that you're getting stronger over time on each lift, and that you learn more about yourself and how to make smarter training decisions. So hopefully this was helpful. If you guys did like this podcast, please leave a rating and review. Follow me on Instagram. I'll talk to you guys in the next one.